Language has been a passion of mine since I was a small child, and my relationship with it is certainly peculiar. But in my later years, I came to recognize that even with my relatively advanced language skills, I was poorly equipped to understand the relationship between language and intelligence, and particularly to understand how language, which seems to be one of the finest, how shall I put it, one of the finest accomplishments and distinctions of our species, one that we must imagine endows us with the possibility of intelligence. It took me a long time to realize that this faculty and its associated repercussions present an unexpected and incredibly deep danger because we're very ignorant about the relationship between language and intelligence. And what this means is, in simple terms, we have far too naive a relationship with language, so that language stands above us, above our intelligence, declaring things down to it as if language itself were a being or an authority or a god even. And very few of us, it seems to me, in our lifetimes, acquire the necessary awareness of this to do anything about it. And many of these people are in narrow fields of expertise, so that when they manage to acquire it, it doesn't leak out into the general public. And in fact, the general public's common standards of language comprehension and mastery are catastrophically low, and they compete against each other to lower the bar further almost every time anyone does or says anything. So we're in a really dangerous relationship with language, and it's my conviction that we have to help each other. No one will save us from this, right? So we all must become activists about our relationships with language and knowledge. And what that means is together to discover and explore and play with and learn about the dangers of our relationships with language and the dangers of our relationships with knowledge, and there are many, many of these. And also their remedies, which are almost always quite accessible. And then finally, the opportunities that have been hidden from us by the fact that most of our relationships with language and knowledge have this peculiar quality of being self-retarding. For all their apparent utility, we're spending way too many possible benefits to get a highly focused, narrow benefit. And in so doing, we're missing the lion's share of the actually available benefits, as well as getting caught up in the dangers. One of the ways that we can begin to learn, there's lots of different aspects of learning about language and its dangers. Many of them deal with the topic known as rhetoric. So this word is often unclear to people who've heard it used casually. In casual use, it can mean, for example, fancy language sophistry that doesn't have any real content or basis or verity, right, truth value. But in philosophy and in the study of language, rhetoric is more or less, it's a broad topic, and there's various ways to come at it. But to make it kind of simple, it is the studies of the forms that we, especially in English and Western languages, use to communicate, including tropes like metaphor and simile, and also a study of the fallacies. A specific branch of rhetoric deals with logical or rhetorical fallacies, excuse me. And this is the study of some 50 or 60, perhaps more, specific errors that are consistently made when we relate with language and arguments. So I think it's that the study of rhetoric is absolutely crucial, and that we need to help each other to learn this topic, which should have been taught to us in childhood. It's shocking that it isn't taught to us in childhood. In fact, it's rarely taught to anyone other than some rather specialized academics. Although some high school students may, in a good school, get a glancing exposure to it, which is completely insufficient and probably will not fascinate them. But we should all really be fascinated with language and rhetoric, rhetorical intelligence, because these are faculties that our conscious intelligence requires to even be possible, right? Without these faculties, language becomes a curse, at least as much as it is an asset. And it is incredibly difficult for common people, even very intelligent people, even linguistically intelligent people, to navigate these hidden reefs of danger that lie in the very nature of our relationship with conscious representation of ideas, concepts, naming, labeling, comparisons, evaluation, perspective. The problem with language that's hard to see is that there's many, but one of the most incredibly important ones is it selects perspectives that are insufficiently broad and declares them as truthful, complete, or trustworthy. And this is always false. But it feels true. So it's kind of a collapse of the possibilities into a specific derivative, right? And the derivative seems godlike. Obviously, that is a tree. No, it isn't. The problem is that tree is a word, and whatever that might be over there we're pointing at actually isn't really distinct. It's only distinct as a convenience. And language emphasizes this convenience and throws away the fact that it's making up a story about something. So we use tokens, like words, to refer to phenomenon. The problem with this is that we are inclined to believe that once we know that that's called a tree, we know what a tree is. We're inclined to confuse the derivatives with what they point to. And when we do that, that creates what you might understand as a collapse of orders. The order of the intelligence that should be overstanding language collapses into language and is now they're existing at the same order, so there's no way to differentiate them. They look like the same thing. If you know the name of the tree, you know what it is, right? Which is of course impossible. To know what a tree is, honestly, is a question that no human lifetime is sufficiently long enough to even begin an approach to. For a tree, like all things, is everything at once in a unique little package, and it's also not distinct. Language distinguishes it, concepts distinguish it, but the tree is not really distinct. Like, one is reminded of the difference between the mind, all of its possibilities, including dreaming and emotion and everything, and words, right? These are not the same order of phenomenon. So if we collapse them and pretend that they are the same order, my mind is what I know in words, you see, we've thrown away the body for the fingernail. And one of the ways that ancient people pointed at this problem, and moderns are not very adept with it, although philosophers can be somewhat, is with paradoxes. And there's some that we're all really familiar with because we've heard them a lot. And I'm going to play through 3 of them quickly to show you an interesting feature of the structure of these paradoxes that, when revealed, not only resolves them, but illustrates the dangers of language in such a way that we can grasp them immediately, I think. So the first one is, which came first, the chicken or the egg? And in this case, we've got a peculiar collapse. I'm not sure exactly what to call it. It appears at first glance to be a collapse of 2 orders of meaning and identity. One, which is derivative, that comes from another that is progenerative of orders of priority, right? Now, that sounds really sophisticated, so let me see if I can make some simple language about that. When we ask which comes first about this phenomenon known as the chicken, you're trying to make like a rod from a circle. And so there's a collapse of dimensionality. We're going from, obviously, even though we may not know what the dimensions are, it's very clear. From a circle to a line, you've collapsed the dimensionality. Now, what's really interesting about a circle is that if you could look at it edge on, it would look like a line. So there's the collapse of dimensionality right there. But there's a really interesting way to approach this paradox that I think is, at least for me, useful, and at once resolves it and demonstrates the problem. When we ask a question like, which comes first, the chicken or the egg, we don't notice that we're playing with language in a way that that was designed to stymie us. Well, maybe we do notice this, but we don't know what to do with it. Insightfully understanding language carefully, we can see that the humans impose a whichness on a circle, and they're demanding that a circle demonstrate the properties of a line. But it can't properly do that. If you put egg at the top and chicken at the bottom of a circle, it's very clear that which comes first, so to speak, depends on your approach. Right? If you approach from the chicken side, it's going to look like the chicken comes first and lays the egg. If you approach from the egg side, it's going to look like the egg comes first and the chicken emerges from it. And then the question is also implying that there must have been a first chicken or a first egg, which is not entirely true and very deceptive. And again, language is collapsing something that has many dimensions into one that is familiar and easily manipulated. The point I want to make, though, is that the human mind formed a perspective and asked this question. The human mind imposed whichness on something that can't possess that mode of whichness, and didn't declare that up front, and so created the problem that it, and then pretended it didn't, and then let the problem lie there and say, this is a normal, real problem. It's obviously a question we can ask. Why doesn't it work? And what is the answer? Well, the answer is kind of which came first. Humans having this goal of putting which into this question came first. So the question answers itself. Which came first, the chicken or the egg? The actual answer is which. Humans putting whichness into a circle where it doesn't fit is what came first in this particular question. And to recognize that, to notice that the human mind imposed a polarity, a dimensional polarity, on something that cannot possibly sustain it, what we discover is that the problem comes from the humans imposing this mode of whichness. Has little to do with chickens or eggs. It has to do with language. So there's that one. Now, there's another one that I find very interesting, which is And all of these paradoxes have implications I'm not exploring. Some of those implications are important, maybe even central. But I want to explore the particular features that are unusually discussed and easily accessed that tell us something about the structure of the paradoxes and of language. So there's this other interesting, not precisely a paradox, but an important, strange question. If a tree falls in the forest and no one is there to hear it, does it make any sound? This is a very sophisticated philosophical question. It's not as obvious as it sounds in simple language. But there are some features of it that I want to point out really quickly. The meaning of the word forest must absolutely be a very complex living place with many organisms. So the idea of a forest with nothing to hear is ridiculous. What we're talking about is not a forest, it's an abstract thought experiment. We're calling it a forest, but it isn't one. And whatever falls there definitely doesn't make a sound because it's an abstract universe. There's never a hearer in that room, right? This whole question establishes like a little imaginary box. And we don't know what it is, but we can be sure it isn't a forest. And there definitely aren't any people in an abstract idea construct, right? So the tree that falls in this forest makes no sound at all, that's for damn sure. But in any kind of real forest, you've got a living hypersystem, right, of myriads of kinds of organisms. In fact, the tree isn't even a single organism. It's not even close to being a single organism. So any tree that falls in a forest, all kinds of things hear it. If there are no things to hear it, that's not a forest. And so there's nothing like that. That's something someone made up in their mind. And whatever falls in that construct doesn't do much of anything. It's just an idea. In any real forest, there are always listeners. So then if we say, okay, well, what if we mean not any listener, but what if we mean if there's a forest and there's no human listener? Does it make a sound? Okay, well, that's a reasonable question. And that defeats my objection. In this case, as we understand the meaning of sound, the question is not too complex. We know that animals are hearing, that there are birds and creatures in this forest. And as long as we are willing to agree that noises that we hear and call sound are the same phenomenon as noises that they hear and call sound, then the question doesn't even exist. It's obviously true. Yes, of course it makes sound. But if we ask something weirder, which is if there's no human there and the tree falls, does it make any sound? Meaning explicitly what a human would perceive and call human sensed sound. That's a more interesting question and a bit more difficult. We must imagine that it does, but with no one to call it sound, is it sound? All of these things are hidden in this question, not easily seen. And finally, thank you for your patience so far, by the way, I want to examine a paradox that's been carefully examined by great thinkers throughout history and may be familiar to you. It's the Liars Paradox. A simple form of it is something like Joe, a Cretan, declares, all Cretans only and always lie. The standing question is Joe telling the truth? Now, obviously, if Joe's telling the truth, then he's lying. If he's lying, he's telling the truth. This is interestingly structurally similar to the chicken and egg question. There's a structural similarity, even though the forms are different. And this is a really interesting and provocative problem here, because there's a solution that's quite fascinating, and it's been partially formalized by others. I have my own preferred formalization, which I'll share with you in a moment, and it may evolve. I don't know that this is the best one, but it's got some astonishing properties, this little formula. formalization, excuse me. So the formalization goes like this. It is a correction that both declares the problem of the problem posed by the liar paradox and solves it. It goes like this. It sounds a little complex, but follow through with me. No statement shall, by self-reference, promote itself to the order of statements whereby it must be interpreted. Now, this is a really peculiar construct. What it implies is that there is, what we might understand, there are two orders of our relationship with language. One is kind of the maker, author, understander order, and the other is the declarative, denotative product order. And so you can't, in the sentence, tell the order that would normally interpret language what to do in the second order in the product. So you can't tell the process what to do in the finished product, is the gist of this little correction. But this has a really fascinating property. So what we discover is that the Liars Paradox has collapsed the interpretation order into the declaration order, so that it lost a dimension again, right? And in fact, it lost dimensionality. It lost the whole interpretive mind. Has been somehow crushed down into the language where it can't exist. And that's the nature of this paradox. And it's a fascinating and brilliantly useful toy to see something that's otherwise almost impossible to see, which is specifically that these two orders must never collapse, and when they do, catastrophe emerges. The statement, no statement shall, by self-reference, promote itself to the order of statements whereby it must be interpreted, is a fascinating reply for a number of interesting reasons. It shows the structure of the problem of the liar paradox. It shows that it's violating an aspect of the structure of language that's normally invisible but must never be violated. And that's amazing by itself. But it has another really peculiar quality. It's self-violating. To say the statement, as I said it, violates the admonition, it violates the directions that statement demand not be violated. It's a self-violating statement that solves a paradox. And by this we can discover something very peculiar about language. One kind of violation creates a sort of infinite loop of blindness. And this is a violation that causes a collapse of two orders into what would usually be the product, right? But another kind of statement, by violating its own structure, returns a clear awareness of the proper structure, solves the paradox. And it's as if there are two polarities of violation. One of them deprives us of insight and intelligence as mind collapses into words and their derivatives. And so there's no more interpretive order above, listening and determining and watching. It's all done in the language. No interpretive order, yeah. So when the interpretive order collapses into the derivatives, into the words, you've got a catastrophe. But there's a way to create a violation, a self-violating reply that restores both our capacity to see the problem and tells us how to avoid it. Fascinatingly, to do this, we must use a self-violating statement. So you see, the statement that I made does what it tells us not to do, right? So it promotes itself to the order of statements whereby it itself must be interpreted. And that would seem impossible. I think you'll find if you play with some of the ideas, which may at first seem a little sophisticated here, you will discover that language has startlingly unusual properties, and that they are although they are sophisticated, they are not beyond our grasp if we have ways to approach and play with them that don't necessarily require sophisticated skill, but take advantage of our fascination and our long exposure and questions about language to draw us back into the dialogue of discovery with each other and language, the history of language, and the struggles of our species, both with language and representational intelligence in general. It is a paradox itself that the animal that has formalized concepts and formal representational skills has been nearly unable to educate themselves about the real potentials and dangers of what might be the most fundamental technology we possess. It is the one with which we are least advanced. And any even small advancement will give us a chance at forming new kinds of collectives, new modes of human intelligence, and perhaps returning the common experience of prodigy to each other, our cultures, our children, and what we're presently calling education.